pity about the face? The words, dripping with scorn, hung in the lavish New York ballroom. Isabella Sterling, the night's glamorous hostess, watched with a smug smile as a smear of pink frosting slid down her target's cheek and onto a stunning jade green silk gown. A wave of nervous laughter followed, but the woman at the center of it all, 29-year-old Maya Jordan, with her long, dark hair framing a face of unnerving calm, didn't flinch. Her silence was a chilling, calculated force. Before we witness the storm her silence unleashes, let us know in the comments where and when you're watching from. If you believe true power is quiet, hit subscribe and share. You won't want to miss this ending. The room believed they were watching a humiliation. They had no idea they were looking at the very woman who held their fortunes in her hand. The price for that cake wouldn't be an apology. It would be an empire. The chandeliers of the Sterling Heritage Foundation's annual gala cast 1,000 prisms of light across the marble floors of the New York Art Museum, each facet gleaming like a diamond in a crown. The air was thick with the scent of orchids and ambition, a heady perfume that clung to the tailored tuxedos and glittering gowns of the city's elite. Champagne flutes clinked in a delicate symphony, their golden bubbles rising like the dreams of those who wielded power in this room. This was no mere fundraiser. It was a battlefield of egos where fortunes were flaunted, alliances forged, and enemies marked with a smile. Into this gilded arena stepped Maya Jordan, a vision of understated elegance at 29. Her jade green silk gown hugged her frame with a precision that spoke of wealth but whispered of restraint. The fabric shimmered as it caught the light, its hue a quiet rebellion against the room's ostentatious reds and golds. Her long, jet-black hair, sleek as midnight, cascaded in soft curls at the ends, swaying gently with each measured step. She wore no ostentatious jewelry, no garish adornments, only a single emerald pendant that rested against her collarbone, its understated glow mirroring the intensity in her dark, observant eyes. Maya was not here to be seen. She was here to see. The room buzzed with the self-assured chatter of the powerful, bankers, heiresses, tech moguls, and politicians, all orbiting one another in a carefully choreographed dance of influence. Yet Maya moved through it like a shadow, her presence barely rippling the surface of their world. She was known to them only as MJ, the enigmatic investor whose millions had fueled the Sterling Foundation's ambitious new art center. Her anonymity was her armor, her silence her weapon. To the uninitiated, she was just another face in the crowd, a young woman of striking beauty, but no apparent pedigree. To those who mattered, she was a phantom, a force whose name was whispered in boardrooms, but never spoken aloud. Maya paused near a towering sculpture, a twisted bronze abstraction that seemed to writhe under the chandelier's glow. She tilted her head, studying it with the same intensity she applied to the room. Her gaze swept across the faces, some familiar from Forbes covers, others from the grainy photos of private dossiers. She noted the way they moved, the way they laughed, the way their eyes darted when they thought no one was watching. This was her game: observation, calculation, control. She didn't need to shout her presence. Her power lay in knowing more than they ever would. Across the room, Isabella Sterling held court. The heiress to the Sterling dynasty was a vision of calculated extravagance, her diamond-encrusted gown catching the light like a beacon. Her blonde hair was swept into an elaborate updo, each curl a testament to hours spent in preparation. At 30, Isabella was the unchallenged queen of this domain, her every gesture radiating the confidence of someone born to rule. She laughed too loudly, her voice cutting through the din as she regaled a cluster of admirers with a story of her latest European escapade. Her eyes, sharp and predatory, scanned the room for anything or anyone that might challenge her dominion. Their gazes met for a fleeting moment. Isabella's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a faint, dismissive smirk as she took in Maya's solitary figure. To Isabella, Maya was an anomaly, a stranger who didn't belong in her carefully curated world. She leaned toward a companion, a sleek woman in a crimson gown, and murmured something that drew a conspiratorial giggle. Her words carried just far enough for Maya to catch them. "I don't know how they let these nouveau riche types in here these days." The insult was delivered with the precision of a blade, meant to wound without drawing blood. Maya's expression didn't falter. Her lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that could be mistaken for politeness but held the weight of something far more dangerous. She turned back to the sculpture, her fingers brushing the emerald pendant as if grounding herself in its cool certainty. Let Isabella play her games. Maya had no intention of engaging. Not yet. She was here to assess, to measure the worth of the Sterling Foundation's promises against the reality of their actions. $50 million of her money rested on that promise, and she did not part with her wealth lightly. The crowd shifted around her, oblivious to the storm she carried within. A waiter offered her a glass of champagne, and she accepted it with a nod, her fingers curling around the stem with a grace that belied the steel in her spine. She sipped slowly, her eyes never leaving the room. She noted the nervous tick of a hedge fund manager, the forced laughter of a senator's wife, the way Isabella's gaze lingered on her just a moment too long. The heiress was unsettled, though she hid it behind her dazzling smile. Good. Let her wonder. The orchestra struck up a new melody, a waltz that filled the room with a haunting elegance. Couples began to pair off, their movements as practiced as their conversations. Maya remained still, a solitary figure amidst the swirl of silk and satin. She had no need to dance. Her rhythm was her own, measured in the quiet beats of strategy and patience. Somewhere in this room, decisions were being made that would shape empires. And Maya Jordan, the invisible architect of Phoenix Capital, intended to shape them too. As the waltz reached its crescendo, Isabella's voice cut through again, sharper this time, directed at no one in particular, but loud enough to draw attention. Some people really don't know their place, she said, her eyes flicking toward Maya. The room didn't pause, but a few heads turned, sensing the undercurrent of a challenge. Maya met Isabella's gaze once more, her smile unchanged, her silence unbroken. The heiress's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat, before she turned away, her laughter ringing a little too shrill. Maya set her champagne flute down on a passing tray, her movements deliberate, her mind already 3 steps ahead. The night was young, and the game had just begun. Isabella Sterling might rule this ballroom, but Maya Jordan ruled the shadows. And in those shadows, she was untouchable. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Heritage Foundation Gala pulsed with the rhythm of wealth and pretense, its opulent glow casting long shadows across the polished marble. The air was alive with the clink of crystal, the murmur of calculated flattery, and the undercurrent of rivalries simmering beneath polished smiles. Maya Jordan stood alone near a towering canvas, a vibrant explosion of color that seemed to pulse with the same quiet intensity as her presence. Her jade-green silk gown shimmered faintly, the emerald pendant at her throat catching the light like a silent vow. She was an island in the sea of elites, her calm observance a stark contrast to the room's frenetic energy. But the weight of eyes was on her now, and none heavier than those of Isabella Sterling. Isabella, radiant in her diamond-encrusted gown, moved through the crowd like a queen surveying her court. Her laughter was a weapon, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the din to ensure all eyes followed her. She thrived on attention, her every gesture a performance designed to cement her dominance. But Maya's quiet composure, her refusal to fawn or falter, gnawed at Isabella's carefully curated world. To the heiress, Maya was an intruder, a young black woman whose elegance and poise dared to challenge the unspoken hierarchy of this gilded space. Isabella's earlier jab, whispered but cutting, had not drawn the reaction she'd hoped for. Maya's faint smile had been a defiance, and Isabella Sterling did not tolerate defiance. As the orchestra shifted to a softer melody, Isabella's gaze locked onto Maya once more. The heiress's lips curled into a smirk, her eyes glinting with the promise of cruelty. She excused herself from her circle of admirers, her movements graceful but predatory, like a panther circling its prey. Maya, still studying the painting, sensed the shift in the air, a tightening, a prelude to something vicious. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the approach, but her senses sharpened, attuned to every rustle of Isabella's gown, every hushed whisper that followed in her wake. Isabella stopped a few feet away, her presence commanding the attention of those nearby. The crowd's chatter softened, their curiosity piqued by the tension radiating from the heiress. She tilted her head, her blonde curls catching the chandelier's light, and plucked a delicate dessert plate from a passing waiter's tray. On it sat a slice of strawberry cake, its pink frosting glistening like a taunt. Isabella's fingers curled around the plate, her manicured nails glinting as she stepped closer, her smile a blade wrapped in silk. "You seem awfully engrossed in that painting," Isabella said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness, loud enough to draw eyes. "It's almost as if you think you belong here." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, a challenge meant to wound. A few guests nearby stifled gasps, their faces alight with anticipation. Maya turned slowly, her dark eyes meeting Isabella's, with a calm that bordered on unnerving. She said nothing, her silence a wall that Isabella's words couldn't breach. The heiress's smile tightened, her patience fraying. She took another step, closing the distance, her heels clicking against the marble with deliberate menace. "You know," she continued, her tone now laced with venom, "it's such a pity about the face." With a theatrical flourish, she lifted the plate and in a single vicious motion smeared the pink frosting across Maya's cheek. The cake crumbled, leaving a sticky trail that dripped onto the jade-green silk of Maya's gown, staining it like a wound. The room froze, the air sucked out in a collective inhale. Then came the laughter, nervous, jagged, rippling through the crowd like a contagion. A few phones slipped from pockets, their cameras flashing to capture the spectacle. Isabella stepped back, her smirk triumphant, her eyes daring Maya to react. The heiress expected tears, outrage, or at the very least, embarrassment. Some crack in the poised facade that would affirm her power. But Maya didn't flinch. The frosting slid down her cheek, a garish contrast to her flawless skin. Yet her expression remained a mask of serene control. Her long dark hair framed her face, the soft curls untouched by the chaos. She stood taller, her shoulders squared, her gaze locked on Isabella with an intensity that made the heiress's smirk falter. The laughter grew uneven, faltering under the weight of Maya's silence. She raised a hand, her movements slow and deliberate, and with a single finger, wiped a smear of frosting from her cheek. She studied it for a moment, as if it were a curiosity rather than an insult, then flicked it away with a gesture so precise it seemed choreographed. The room watched, transfixed, as the tide of amusement began to ebb. Isabella's triumph wavered, her eyes darting to the crowd for reassurance, but the faces she met were no longer certain. Maya's silence was not surrender. It was a weapon, honed and lethal. It stripped the moment of its levity, exposing the cruelty beneath Isabella's act. The heiress shifted, her confidence cracking under the weight of that unyielding gaze. The crowd's laughter died entirely, replaced by an uneasy murmur. A woman in a sapphire gown whispered to her companion, "Who is she?" A man in a tuxedo leaned closer, his phone already open to a search. The air grew heavy, charged with the sense that something pivotal was unfolding. Isabella, sensing the shift, forced a laugh, high and brittle. "Oh, come now," she said, her voice straining to reclaim control. "It's just a bit of fun. No need to make a scene." But the words sounded hollow, a desperate attempt to rewrite the narrative. Maya's eyes never left hers, and in that moment, Isabella realized she had miscalculated. The woman before her was no mere guest, no easy target. There was power in Maya's stillness, a promise of consequences that made the heiress's heart stutter. The orchestra played on, its notes a haunting counterpoint to the tension. Maya's gown, stained but still radiant, clung to her like armor. The emerald pendant at her throat gleamed, a silent testament to her resolve. She had come to this gala not to play their games but to master them. And as the crowd's whispers grew, as the first seeds of doubt took root, Maya Jordan stood at the center of it all, her silence louder than any words could ever be. The cake was not the end of this story. It was merely the spark. The grand ballroom of the Sterling Heritage Foundation Gala stood suspended in a brittle hush, the air thick with the aftershock of Isabella Sterling's cruelty. The pink frosting smeared across Maya Jordan's cheek glistened under the chandelier's glow, a garish stain on her flawless composure. Her jade-green silk gown, now marred by streaks of cream, clung to her like a battle-worn banner. Yet she stood unyielding, a statue carved from defiance. The laughter that had erupted moments ago, nervous, cruel, and complicit, faltered into an uneasy silence. The crowd, a sea of sequins and tailored suits, watched with bated breath, their eyes darting between the poised figure of Maya and the smirking heiress who had dared to strike. Isabella Sterling stood a few paces away, her diamond-encrusted gown catching the light like a beacon of untouchable privilege. Her smirk lingered, but it was fraying at the edges, strained by the weight of Maya's unblinking gaze. The heiress had expected a reaction, tears, anger, or at least a hurried retreat, but Maya offered none. Instead, she stood rooted, her dark eyes sweeping the room with a calm that felt like the prelude to a storm. The frosting dripped slowly, a single bead tracing a path down her jaw before falling to the marble floor. She made no move to wipe it away. Instead, with a deliberate grace that silenced the last titters of laughter, she raised a hand and brushed a finger along her cheek, collecting a smear of pink. She studied it, her expression unreadable, then let her hand fall, the gesture dismissing the act as if it were beneath her notice. The room felt the shift. What had begun as a spectacle of humiliation was transforming into something else entirely. Maya's silence was not the surrender Isabella had anticipated. It was a force, heavy as lead, pressing down on the crowd's collective conscience. The nervous giggles died out, replaced by a creeping unease. Guests shifted uncomfortably, their champagne flutes forgotten in their hands. A woman in a sapphire gown clutched her clutch tighter, her eyes flickering with guilt. A man in a pinstripe suit lowered his phone, the video he'd been recording suddenly feeling like evidence of his own complicity. Isabella's triumph, so certain moments ago, began to curdle. Maya's gaze moved slowly, deliberately across the faces in the room. She noted each one: the senator's aide who had laughed loudest, the socialite who had covered her mouth to hide her smirk, the banker who had turned away as if nothing had happened. Her eyes, dark and fathomless, seemed to etch their features into her memory, a ledger of those who had chosen to revel in her supposed shame. The weight of her scrutiny was unbearable, a silent accusation that stripped away their pretense of civility. The orchestra's melody, soft and lilting, felt out of place, its notes clashing with the tension that gripped the room. Isabella, sensing the tide turning, forced a laugh, high and brittle. "Oh, come on," she said, her voice slicing through the silence. "It was just a bit of fun. No need to be so dramatic." But her words fell flat, swallowed by the void of Maya's response. The heiress took a step forward, her heels clicking with forced confidence, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. She had expected to break this stranger, to reassert her dominance with a single cruel act. Instead, she found herself standing before a woman whose stillness was more commanding than any outburst could have been. The crowd's unease grew palpable. Whispers began to ripple, soft at first, then gaining strength. A man in a corner, his glasses glinting as he leaned toward a companion, murmured, "Wait, she looks familiar. Is that?" His voice trailed off, but his words sparked a chain reaction. A woman nearby, her pearls gleaming against her throat, pulled out her phone and began typing furiously, her fingers trembling. "Maya Jordan," she whispered to her husband, her voice barely audible. "I think that's Maya Jordan." The name spread like wildfire, carried on hushed breaths and furtive glances. Phones lit up across the room, screens glowing with search results and half-remembered articles. At the edge of the crowd, a tech journalist in a slightly rumpled suit squinted at Maya, his mind racing. He'd seen her once before, at a conference in San Francisco, a fleeting glimpse of a woman who moved through the world like a whisper. "No way," he muttered, pulling up an article on his phone. "Phoenix Capital, MJ." His voice grew louder, drawing the attention of those nearby. "That's her. That's Maya Jordan of Phoenix Capital." The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of shock through the room. Isabella's head snapped toward the journalist, her smirk vanishing. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice sharp but tinged with unease. The journalist didn't answer her directly. Instead, he looked at Maya, his eyes wide with recognition. The crowd's whispers grew into a low hum, a chorus of realization that threatened to drown out the orchestra. Maya remained still, her expression unchanged, But her silence now carried a different weight, a promise, a warning. The room was no longer laughing. It was watching, waiting, fearing what might come next. Isabella's hands twitched at her sides, her composure unraveling. She opened her mouth to speak, to reclaim control, but the words caught in her throat. Maya's silence had become a mirror, reflecting the heiress's cruelty back at her. The crowd's eyes, once fixed on Maya as a target, now turned to Isabella, their judgment shifting. The air grew heavier, the chandelier's light suddenly too harsh, exposing every flaw in the scene. Maya Jordan, with a smear of frosting on her cheek and a stain on her gown, was no longer the victim. She was something else entirely, a force that had yet to reveal its full power. The ballroom of the Sterling Heritage Foundation Gala hung in a precarious silence, the air thick with the residue of Isabella Sterling's calculated cruelty. The smear of pink frosting on Maya Jordan's cheek glistened like a badge of war, a stark contrast to the unblemished jade-green silk of her gown. Yet Maya stood unshaken, her dark eyes a quiet storm, sweeping across the faces of the elite who had laughed at her moments before. The crowd's unease was palpable, their earlier amusement now a sour memory as they sensed the shift in the room's gravity. Isabella, her diamond-encrusted gown glittering like a fading star, stood frozen, her smirk crumbling under the weight of Maya's unrelenting composure. The heiress had expected to break her target. Instead, she found herself caught in a trap she hadn't seen coming. The whispers that had begun to ripple through the crowd grew louder, a chorus of curiosity and dawning realization. Phones glowed in trembling hands, their screens flashing with names and headlines. The tech journalist in the rumpled suit, his glasses catching the chandelier's light, stood at the edge of the crowd, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "That's Maya Jordan," he said again, louder now, his words carrying a weight that silenced the orchestra's faint strains. "The founder of Phoenix Capital, the one they call MJ." The name landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the room, turning heads and widening eyes. The crowd's collective breath caught, as if the air itself had been stolen. Isabella's head snapped toward the journalist, her face a mask of disbelief. "What?" she snapped, her voice sharp but unsteady, betraying the crack in her confidence. She took a step forward, her heels clicking on the marble, but the gesture felt hollow, a desperate attempt to reclaim control. Her eyes darted to Maya, searching for a flaw, a hint that this was a mistake. But Maya's expression remained a fortress, calm, impenetrable, her silence louder than any retort. The frosting on her cheek, once a mark of humiliation, now seemed to mock Isabella's hubris, a silent testament to the heiress's miscalculation. The journalist stepped closer, undeterred by Isabella's glare. "You heard me," he said, his voice steady, almost gleeful. "Maya Jordan, Phoenix Capital, the investor who's been bankrolling your new art center. Or did you not know?" His words were a blade slicing through the room's pretense. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a flurry of whispers. "Phoenix Capital?" A woman in a velvet gown murmured, her eyes wide. That's the MJ?" A man in a tuxedo beside her scrolled frantically on his phone, pulling up a profile that confirmed the truth. The name Phoenix Capital was a legend in their world, a shadowy force that built empires and toppled them with equal precision. Maya at last broke her silence. Her voice was low, clear, and cold as steel, cutting through the room like a blade through silk. "Isabella," she said, her tone devoid of anger, but heavy with authority, "is your performance over?" The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that made the heiress flinch. The crowd leaned in, their earlier amusement replaced by a mix of awe and dread. Maya's gaze never wavered, her eyes locking onto Isabella's with a precision that felt like judgment. The room was hers now, and everyone knew it. Isabella's face flushed, her composure unraveling. "You think you can talk to me like that?" she spat, her voice rising in a desperate bid to reassert her dominance. "Who do you think you are?" But the question hung unanswered, its defiance weakened by the growing realization in the room. The crowd's eyes shifted from Isabella to Maya, their allegiance wavering. The heiress's power, once unquestionable, now seemed fragile, a house of cards trembling in the wind. The journalist, emboldened, raised his voice again. "She's Maya Jordan," he said, his words ringing with finality. "The woman who's been pulling the strings behind your precious foundation. The one who's been signing checks as MJ. Or did you not bother to check who you were inviting to your little party?" His tone was sharp, almost mocking, and the crowd's murmurs grew into a low roar. Phones were raised higher now, not to capture humiliation, but to document a reckoning. The name Maya Jordan spread like wildfire, each whisper fanning the flames of shock and fear. Isabella's hands clenched at her sides, her knuckles white against the shimmer of her gown. "That's impossible," she said, but her voice cracked, betraying her panic. She turned to her companions, seeking support, but they averted their eyes, their loyalty crumbling under the weight of the truth. The crowd's gaze was now fixed on Maya, their earlier laughter replaced by a stunned reverence. The woman they had dismissed as an outsider was no victim. She was a titan, her power hidden in plain sight. Maya's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, not one of triumph, but of certainty. She took a single step forward, the stained silk of her gown rustling softly, a reminder of the insult she had endured. "You invited me here, Isabella," she said, her voice steady, each word a stone in a collapsing wall. "You invited MJ, and now you know who I am." The simplicity of her words belied their impact. The room seemed to shrink around her, the chandelier's light dimming in comparison to the quiet fire in her eyes. The crowd was silent now, their earlier mirth replaced by a collective realization of their own complicity. The senator's aide, who had laughed now, stared at the floor. The socialite, who had smirked now, clutched her pearls, her face pale. The banker, who had turned away, now met Maya's gaze, his eyes wide with fear. They had underestimated her, and now they stood on the precipice of consequences they couldn't yet fathom. The orchestra, sensing the shift, faltered, its notes fading into a haunting silence. Isabella stood alone, her empire of influence crumbling around her. Her eyes darted frantically, searching for an ally, a way to salvage her pride. But the room had turned, its allegiance shifting to the woman who stood before them, unbroken and unbowed. Maya Jordan, the phantom of Phoenix Capital, had stepped out of the shadows, and with her name spoken aloud, the game had changed forever. The ballroom of the Sterling Heritage Foundation Gala stood frozen, its opulent glow dimmed by the seismic shift in power that now pulsed through the room. Maya Jordan, her jade-green silk gown stained with pink frosting, stood at the center of the storm, her presence a towering force that eclipsed the chandeliers above. The smear on her cheek, once a mark of humiliation, now gleamed like a battle scar, a testament to her unyielding resolve. The crowd, moments ago a sea of mocking whispers, was now a gallery of stunned faces, their eyes wide with the dawning realization of who she was. The name Maya Jordan hung in the air, a blade unsheathed, and the revelation of her identity as MJ of Phoenix Capital had turned the tide. Isabella Sterling, her diamond-encrusted gown no longer a symbol of supremacy, stood pale and trembling, her smirk replaced by a flicker of dread. The tech journalist's voice still echoed in the silence, his words. "She's Maya Jordan, the founder of Phoenix Capital," a spark that had ignited a firestorm. The crowd's phones, once raised to capture a moment of cruelty, now glowed with frantic searches, confirming the truth that had unraveled their world. Isabella's eyes darted, seeking an escape, but there was none. The room was no longer hers. It belonged to the woman she had underestimated, the woman whose silence had been a prelude to power. Maya's gaze, cold and unyielding, locked onto Isabella's. The heiress flinched, her hands twitching at her sides as if grasping for the authority that was slipping through her fingers. The crowd leaned in, their breath held, sensing the weight of what was to come. Maya's voice, when it came, was a low, deliberate blade, cutting through the suffocating silence. "I came here tonight," she said, each word measured, "to see how my $50 million was being spent." The number landed like a hammer, drawing gasps from the onlookers. "I invested in vision, in respect, in something worthy." She paused, her eyes never leaving Isabella's. "You've shown me none of those things." The room seemed to contract, the air growing heavier with every syllable. Isabella's face drained of color, her lips parting as if to protest, but no sound came. The crowd's murmurs grew, a low hum of shock and fear. Maya's words were not just a rebuke. They were a verdict, delivered with the precision of a judge. She reached into the small clutch at her side, pulling out her phone with a grace that belied the storm she was about to unleash. Her fingers moved swiftly, her expression unchanging, as she tapped out a message. The soft click of her screen locking echoed in the silence, a sound as final as a gavel. "I've just instructed my legal team," Maya continued, her voice rising just enough to ensure every ear in the room caught her words, "to withdraw every cent of Phoenix Capital's investment from the Sterling Foundation." A collective gasp swept through the crowd, a sound of pure visceral shock. "And as of 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," she added, her tone as calm as a still sea, "Phoenix Capital will begin selling off every share we hold in Sterling Corp." The words were a death knell, their impact rippling through the room like a shockwave. The Sterling Foundation, a cornerstone of the family's legacy, was now teetering on the edge of ruin. Sterling Corp, the sprawling empire that underpinned their wealth, faced a financial catastrophe that could shatter it within hours. The crowd's faces mirrored the devastation. Bankers paled, socialites clutched their pearls, and investors scrambled for their phones, their fingers trembling as they dialed brokers in a futile attempt to brace for the fallout. The orchestra's faint melody faltered, its notes swallowed by the chaos unfolding. Isabella staggered back, her hand grasping at the air as if to steady herself. "You can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a plea wrapped in disbelief. Her eyes, wide with panic, searched Maya's face for a hint of mercy, but found only steel. The heiress who had ruled this room with a smirk and a cruel gesture was now a ghost of herself, her empire crumbling under the weight of her own hubris. "You can't do this," she repeated, louder now, but the words sounded hollow, a child's defiance against an inevitable storm. Maya tilted her head slightly, the faintest trace of a smile touching her lips. Not of triumph, but of certainty. "I already have," she said, her voice a quiet thunder that silenced the room once more. She turned her gaze to the crowd, her eyes sweeping over the faces that had laughed at her, mocked her, dismissed her. "You all saw what happened here tonight?" she said, her words carrying a weight that made the air tremble. "You chose to laugh, to record, to do nothing. Now you'll see what it costs." The room was a tableau of shock and fear, the elite stripped of their veneer of invincibility. A senator's wife dropped her champagne flute, the glass shattering on the marble floor, a sound that echoed like a gunshot. A hedge fund manager muttered frantically into his phone, his voice rising in panic. Isabella's father, Arthur Sterling, pushed through the crowd, his face a mask of fury and terror. "Isabella," he hissed, his voice low but venomous. "What have you done?" His eyes flicked to Maya, a mix of desperation and dread. But he said nothing to her. He knew better. Maya stood unmoved, the frosting on her cheek now a symbol of her victory. The jade-green gown, stained but regal, clung to her like armor. She was no longer the outsider, the target of their scorn. She was Maya Jordan, the architect of empires, the woman who held their fortunes in her hands, and she had just burned their world to the ground. The ballroom of the Sterling Heritage Foundation Gala was a mausoleum of shattered illusions, its once vibrant opulence now a hollow shell. The chandeliers cast their fractured light over a crowd frozen in the wake of Maya Jordan's proclamation. Her words, "Phoenix Capital will sell off every share we hold in Sterling Corp," hung in the air like a guillotine's blade, their finality slicing through the last vestiges of the room's grandeur. The smear of pink frosting on Maya's cheek, a lingering mark of Isabella Sterling's cruelty, gleamed defiantly against her jade-green silk gown, now a symbol of her unassailable power. The crowd, once a chorus of mocking laughter, stood paralyzed, their faces etched with a mix of horror and disbelief. The empire they had toasted just hours ago was crumbling, and the woman they had scorned held the match. Isabella Sterling stood at the epicenter of the collapse, her diamond-encrusted gown no longer a crown but a shroud. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a terror that stripped away her carefully crafted veneer of invincibility. The heiress who had ruled this room with a smirk and a vicious act now seemed small, her hands trembling at her sides as the weight of Maya's verdict sank in. The Sterling Foundation, her family's pride, faced ruin. Sterling Corp., the bedrock of their wealth, was hours away from a financial maelstrom that could reduce it to ashes. Her lips parted, but no words came, only a shallow, ragged breath that betrayed her unraveling. The room erupted into chaos, a frenetic undercurrent of panic that shattered the gala's polished facade. Phones lit up like fireflies, their screens glowing with desperate calls to brokers, advisors, anyone who might stem the impending disaster. A banker in a tailored tuxedo shouted into his phone, his voice cracking as he demanded, "Sell what you can, now!" A socialite in a crimson gown clutched her husband's arm, her whispered pleas drowned by the rising tide of voices. The orchestra, sensing the futility of its melody, fell silent, its last notes fading into the cacophony of a world unmoored. The air was thick with the scent of fear, a sharp contrast to the orchids and champagne that had defined the night. Arthur Sterling, Isabella's father, pushed through the crowd, his face a mask of fury and dread. His silver hair was disheveled, his eyes wild as he reached his daughter. "Isabella," he hissed, his voice low but venomous, "what have you done?" The words were a blade, cutting through the last threads of her composure. He didn't wait for an answer. His gaze flicked to Maya, a fleeting moment of recognition that carried both respect and terror. He knew who she was now, the phantom of Phoenix Capital, the architect of their downfall. But he said nothing to her. No words could undo the sentence she had passed. Isabella's eyes darted around the room, searching for allies, but found only averted gazes and retreating backs. Her so-called friends, the sycophants who had laughed at her cruel jest, now distanced themselves, their loyalty evaporating in the face of ruin. A woman in a sapphire gown turned away, her pearls clicking as she whispered to her companion. A tech mogul who had toasted Isabella's wit now stared at his phone, his face pale as he calculated his losses. The crowd parted, leaving Isabella isolated in a sea of whispers, her empire collapsing under the weight of her own arrogance. Maya stood unmoved, her presence a quiet thunder that commanded the room. The frosting on her cheek, the stain on her gown, only amplified her authority, transforming her from victim to victor. Her dark eyes swept over the chaos, noting every detail. The trembling hands, the frantic calls, the faces drained of color. She had not raised her voice, had not needed to. Her power was in her precision, her calm, her ability to wield silence as a weapon sharper than any shout. The crowd's fear was her vindication, their panic the price of their complicity. Isabella's knees buckled, and she stumbled, her heels scraping against the marble. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking, a plea to no one. Her hands clutched at the air, as if she could grasp the empire slipping away. The crowd watched, their earlier amusement replaced by a grim fascination. This was no longer a gala, it was a reckoning, and Isabella Sterling was its first casualty. Her eyes, once sharp with malice, now brimmed with tears, her pride shattered into fragments, as fragile as the glass littering the floor from a dropped flute. Arthur Sterling grabbed his daughter's arm, his grip tight with desperation. "Fix this," he growled, but his voice held no hope. He knew, as did everyone, that there was no fixing this. Maya Jordan had spoken, and her words were law. The Sterling legacy, built on generations of wealth and influence, was unraveling in a single night, undone by a single act of cruelty. The crowd's whispers grew into a roar, a cacophony of fear and regret, as the reality of their losses sank in. Maya's gaze lingered on Isabella for a moment longer, her expression unreadable but resolute. She had no need for further words, her actions had spoken. The room gasped, not just in shock, but in awe of the woman who had turned their world upside down. The jade-green gown, stained but radiant, clung to her like a mantle of royalty. She was no longer the outsider they had mocked. She was the arbiter of their fate, and they would not forget her name. The ballroom of the Sterling Heritage Foundation Gala was a shattered kingdom, its opulence reduced to a hollow echo of panic and ruin. The chandeliers flickered, their light casting jagged shadows over a crowd reeling from Maya Jordan's devastating decree. The smear of pink frosting on her cheek, the stain on her jade-green silk gown, had transformed from marks of humiliation into emblems of triumph. Maya stood at the heart of the chaos, her dark eyes unyielding, her silence a thunder that had toppled an empire. The Sterling Foundation was bankrupt. Sterling Corp teetered on the brink, and Isabella Sterling, the once untouchable heiress, stood broken, her diamond-encrusted gown a glittering mockery of her fallen reign. The room buzzed with frenetic energy, phones ringing, voices shouting, the elite scrambling to salvage their fortunes. Arthur Sterling, his face a mask of rage and despair, gripped his daughter's arm, his whispered commands lost in the din. Isabella's eyes, red-rimmed and glassy, stared blankly at the marble floor, her pride shattered into fragments as sharp as the broken glass scattered nearby. The crowd, once her adoring court, had turned their backs, their whispers now laced with scorn for the heiress who had brought ruin upon them all. Maya's words, "Phoenix Capital will sell off every share," echoed in their minds, a death sentence for the Sterling legacy. Maya turned, her movements deliberate, her stained gown rustling like a battle flag. She began to walk, each step a measured declaration of victory. The crowd parted instinctively, their fear and awe carving a path through the sea of sequins and suits. The emerald pendant at her throat caught the light, a beacon of her unassailable power. She didn't look back at Isabella, didn't need to. The heiress's empire was crumbling, and Maya had no more words to waste on her. But as she reached the center of the ballroom, a desperate cry pierced the chaos. "Wait!" Isabella's voice cracked, raw with panic. The heiress stumbled forward, her high heels clattering on the marble, her composure obliterated. "Please, wait!" She reached for Maya, her trembling hand grasping at the sleeve of the jade-green gown. The crowd froze, their eyes wide, as Isabella, the queen of this world, fell to her knees. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, her voice a jagged plea. "It was a stupid joke. I didn't mean it. Please, Don Suado." Her words dissolved into a choked gasp, her hands clutching at Maya's arm as if it were a lifeline. "You can't do this. You want anything, I'll do it. Just take it back." The room held its breath, the air thick with the weight of Isabella's fall. Her diamond gown sparkled incongruously against her crumpled form, her blonde curls unraveling as she begged. The crowd watched, transfixed, their earlier laughter now a distant shame. A senator's wife pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening with unease. A tech mogul stood rooted, his phone forgotten, as he witnessed the heiress's humiliation. Arthur Sterling took a step toward his daughter, then stopped, his face a war of fury and helplessness. He knew there was no undoing this. Maya paused, her expression as calm as a still sea. She looked down at Isabella's hand, still clutching her sleeve, and with a slow, deliberate motion, freed herself from the grip. The gesture was gentle but final, a rejection that needed no words. She turned to face the heiress, her eyes cold as winter, unflinching in their judgment. "Your apology isn't for me," Maya said, her voice low but resonant, carrying to every corner of the room. "It's for the employees you'll face tomorrow, the investors you've betrayed, the legacy you've burned to the ground." Each word was a stone, building a wall between Isabella's desperation and Maya's resolve. Isabella's hands fell limp, her body sagging as the last of her strength drained away. She knelt there, a broken figure in a glittering gown, her empire reduced to ash. The crowd's silence was deafening, their fear of Maya now a palpable reverence. They parted further, their movements almost reverent, creating a corridor of respect for the woman who had reshaped their world in a single night. Maya's gaze swept over them one last time, a silent reckoning for those who had laughed, who had recorded, who had stood by and done nothing. As she resumed her walk, her heels clicked softly against the marble, a metronome of victory. She passed the tech journalist who had named her, his eyes alight with admiration. She paused, leaning close, her voice a whisper meant only for him. "Write this," she said. "Dignity is the only asset no one can price." He nodded, his pen already scribbling in his mind, knowing this moment would be immortalized in ink. Maya reached the grand doors of the museum, the night air beckoning beyond. The crowd watched, their breath held as she stepped into the threshold. The jade-green gown, stained but radiant, shimmered under the streetlights, casting her silhouette against the darkness. She was no victim, no outsider. She was a queen, her throne forged in the fires of her own making. Behind her, Isabella remained on her knees, a solitary figure in a room that had abandoned her, her sobs swallowed by the silence of a fallen dynasty. Maya Jordan stepped into the night, leaving behind a shattered empire and a legacy rewritten. The city's pulse seemed to quicken in her presence, its lights bowing to her as she disappeared into the shadows, a queen who had claimed her crown. As the curtains close on Maya Jordan's triumphant exit, we're left with a story of resilience, power, and the price of pride. What did you think of Maya's unwavering strength or Isabella's shattering fall? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Did this tale spark inspiration or provoke reflection? Thank you for joining us in this gripping journey through a world of empires and reckonings. Stay tuned for more stories that challenge, captivate, and inspire. Until we meet again, keep your own dignity priceless.